many years, and I was actually down at this field school, 5-6 years ago. Actually showed up a little bit late in the morning, and I said, I was giving him a hard time for showing up late, and he says, oh, I just finished spraying. I was spraying all night long. And so I said, really? And so then we chatted about that a little bit, and so I'm very happy that Don is here to sort of, talk about his experiences on the farm and sort of the practical nature of this. And I'll sort of start off with maybe a little bit of why it may or may not be a good idea to spray at night. So first of all, I'd like a show of hands. How many people in the crowd do spray at night from time to time? So there's been more. I've asked this question 3 days in a row, and there's always a few more hands than I expect. How many people think it's a totally crazy idea? Yay. So you're just being shy, because I know there's a few of you out there that probably think it is a crazy idea. So the other question I'll ask is, how many people are doing it herbicides only, or are they doing insecticides and fungicides as well? What's that? Fungicide treatments. Some people are doing both. So, and then when we get into sort of with Don talking, we sort of ask him about, is there a time of year, is he doing this sort of early in the spring, or is he doing it in the middle of the crop year as well, in terms of when he might be doing it. So I guess I'll ask again from the audience, just before I get into my part of it a little bit, is maybe a few of you that are doing it, why are you doing it? There's a couple of hands over here. So why are you spraying at night?
Wind finally dies down.
Yeah. So wind is an obvious one, I think, in southern Alberta.
Get away from the heat of it. Heat and low humidity.
The heat of the day, and you brought up the humidity. Okay. Anything else?
Just sometimes you don't have time.
And just a time factor, which is
factor.
very important. So we all have larger farms, and I think more and more we seem to be fighting the weather. I don't know, like even in my research program, it's just been brutal the last 3 years to try and get things seeded on time, and then we're late seeding, so then we know we're late spraying, and then everything gets backed up for the whole year. So we'll talk a little bit about why there could be some advantages and disadvantages for this first, if we go to the night spraying. And I want to sort of break it into a couple of different components. For a herbicide to work, one of the first things that has to happen, obviously, I guess it has to get onto the plant, so you have to get coverage. But the first main thing that happens is you have to get absorption into the plant, and then after it's in the plant, most of our herbicides are systemic. They have to move within the plant, so they have to translocate within the plant. And those are somewhat two different processes, and they happen in quite different mechanisms. So the first one, in terms of absorption, it's quite a bit about droplet drying time. So we spray that droplet on the leaf surface, and the longer that herbicide stays in solution in that spray droplet, the more time there is for it to penetrate the wax layer and the cuticle layer that's on the leaf. And so we have more potential to get more uptake into the plant. And so that's the first thing that is really required for a herbicide to work. So at nighttime, the first thing that happens, if it's a little bit cooler, we have a little more humidity or a little bit of moisture in the air, that cuticle will be more hydrated. And if you've heard me speak on this subject before, the cuticle is like a sponge. So when it's very dry, it's sort of compressed, and it'll be sort of skinny like that. As soon as we get a little humidity, a little water into it, it becomes fatter. It gets more porous. In fact, those pores become more open, so the herbicide can sort of weave its way through those diverse channels and get into the cells below the cuticle and below the wax. And that's true even for contact herbicides. We say they just have to hit the leaf and burn the leaf. That's not actually technically true. They still have to get through the wax layer in the cuticle and get to the cell underneath that to actually have the killing effect on the plant. So if we have it staying in solution because the temperatures are cooler, the wind speed is lower, we don't have the sunlight that's drying it out, those are all reasons why we might get a little more uptake. The other one is that many of our herbicides are broken down by UV radiation. And what we've largely done to counteract that is we've come up with a good adjuvant system, a good surfactant, which just increases the uptake into the plant enough that it sort of negates that problem. So a prime example of that would be when Post was registered in 1982. It was initially registered with a non-ionic surfactant, and we realized as researchers right away that we could measure a 30 to 50% reduction in the activity of Post within about 45 to 60 minutes of sunlight if we sprayed at noon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So we fed that information back to BSF. BSF went back in the laboratories, and then they developed merge adjuvant, which was really the most spectacular adjuvant at that time, and it's still one of our very best ones, and it's used with other chemistry because it's so good. But all we did is we got around that problem by just getting that herbicide. Instead of taking a couple hours to get into the plant, we now got it in within 15 or 20 minutes. So that's another reason why the whole absorption thing could be greater during at nighttime. Now the translocation thing is totally different. Translocation occurs when the plant is growing, and when we have sunlight and we have photosynthesis in the plant, it's producing sugars, and those sugars are moving from the leaves where we have photosynthesis, and they're maybe moving up to the growing point of the plant, or they could be moving down into the root system of the plant. But all the herbicides, they just go along for the ride with those moving sugars. And that's the same for an insecticide or a fungicide. So if we don't have an actively growing plant, we don't have that sugars moving around, then the herbicide is just going to sit where we put it into the leaf. So that's when we sort of talk about, you've heard this actively growing conditions again. We need to get that herbicide to move to the site of action. So if we want to kill a weed, in most cases just getting it into the leaf is not enough. We need to get it to the growing point of the plant to actually have that killing effect. So if a weed is stressed, if it's drought stressed or is under cold conditions or whatever, you think it's half dead already, we can apply a herbicide and we can finish it off. That's the exact opposite. The healthier that weed is, the better kill we're going to get on all of our systemic herbicides. And then in terms of our crop, actually an actively growing crop will degrade that herbicide. So most of our crops are tolerant because they break down the herbicide so fast that it doesn't have a chance to exert its killing effect. But if we were to spray a plant after a frost at night, or very cold conditions, or waterlogged soil that we had this spring, it's not growing nearly as well as it should be, and then we can sometimes get some herbicide injury that we would not get in other conditions. So the absorption and the translocation thing is sort of different, and we'll talk about some types of different modes of action at chemistry a little bit. But I think now I want to turn it over to Don, and he'll talk about his experience, and then we want you to ask lots of questions, and then we have a few plots that we're going to look here at the very end as well.
I think the first time that I got thinking about night spraying, it was a day not greatly unlike we see right here. It was in fact, it might have even been hotter. It was, I think it was 03. And it seemed like every day we were hitting 30 degrees. And I'm from Three Hills, about 280 kilometers, virtually straight north of here. And you get reading the labels on some of the chemicals you're spraying, and we're above that temperature. Well, why don't I just spray at night instead when it's cooler? I don't see anything about not doing that. Another thing that happened, you didn't steal my thunder today, Bob, for a change. The other event that happened that very same year was auto steering. And to me, you can't really do night. This is almost academic. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted when you start talking about anything to do with auto steering. I bet you there is. Is there anybody out there that doesn't auto steer? Not a single one. Not a chalk. So you're trying to beat the heat factor, and I've just been dying to say this. Is it just me or all those trees pointing to the northeast? You're avoiding the wind as well. That's northeast. I think it is. So you get those. This way. Well, the trees are leaning that way, though. So to get out of the wind factor, which we can have just the problem up in Three Hills as you can here with wind, and get out of the heat factor, and that's when I kind of started night spraying. It kind of helps if you're a nighthawk, by the way, from a logistical standpoint. If you like being up at night, that even helps more. So I just have a pull type sprayer. Can answer all the questions before I get asked. But it's got a bigger tank than even the deer. It's just a branch suspended boom. So I'm limited to 20 kilometers an hour for spraying because the tail starts wagging the dog otherwise with a pull type sprayer. That was an interesting conversation Bob referred to back in, I think I remember Bob 6-7 years ago anyway. And I asked him, I says, is there such a thing, because it's generally not addressed on labels, as too much dew to spray chemical on, and that's what really, I think, is the reason I ended up here, that very question so many years ago. And Bob's basic answer, and you can elaborate later, Bob, but was basically no, there's no such thing as too much dew. And since I don't worry about the tires, water flying off them when you're spraying at 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that. So I've enjoyed, I can't think of a single failure from spraying on dew or at night, really.
And so you have 1 or 2 examples where you think you've had better control, Don?
Well, and I'll use the Liberty example because it seems in our area, Liberty gets a bad rap or has a bad name. I do, if you read the label, how many read labels out of sheer curiosity? Liars. Anyway, I do absolutely everything wrong relative to that label. I don't use enough water, probably don't spray at the rates they want, spray it at night, everything's wrong. And I really like Liberty. I've never had a failure on Liberty at all. And that's why I don't understand why Liberty often gets quoted for herbicide performance issues. I really like it. It's a good rotational product as well. So there's a whirlwind, speaking of.
Specifically on Liberty, Don, do you ever take into account the conditions that are going to be prevalent 24
subsequent
hours ahead?
Yeah, the thought is there, as long as it turns sunny the next day
Sunny and hot, yeah.
or two, it's a consideration, but you know what spraying's like. If the crop and weeds are at the right stage, spray it and hope for the best, really.
Is there a question on the dew issue? Do we want to talk about that a bit more? So how many people are worried about it being too wet with the dew sometimes?
So you're saying that there isn't really an issue with dew?
I'm saying probably 80% of the time or so there's not. So what has to happen for the plant, dew or rainfall, what has to happen is the spray droplets are sprayed on the leaf, and it has to be so wet that those spray droplets will coalesce with one another. They have to merge either with another spray droplet or they have to merge with a water droplet that's already on the leaf. And they have to be large enough that they actually become large enough that they will fall off the leaf or they will roll off the leaf. So actually become so large that gravity just sort of sucks them off the leaf. That's the only case where you can have loss in terms of an uptake. So after a light rain, you will have enough big water droplets on there that the spray droplet hits that droplet, some of those droplets will come off. In a dew situation, most of the time that's not going to happen. So it's going to be pretty wet, but it's going to be sort of like an even wetness. The whole surface is wetness. You don't have big droplets there. And in most cases, it's not going to be a concern in terms of it actually rolling off of the leaf. And the good thing is you have hydrated cuticle, you have a slower droplet drying time, and you can get more absorption into the plant.
There shouldn't be a herbicide difference in the crop, right? For large droplets, there shouldn't make any difference what you chemical.
Well, I think we're talking in general terms of absorption into it. So when we talk about weed control, we want to get as much as possible into the weed. Now, everything I've just sort of talked about, I mean, it's the same thing for the crop. So if you have borderline tolerance to a crop from a herbicide you might be using, then potentially you can get a little bit more injury on that crop. That's the situation, right? So if just winter conditions are not favorable for that crop anyway, it's not actively growing. Like I say, we have very near freezing conditions overnight, or it's under drought stress or waterlogged, and then if we get more of it into the plant, then that actually worsens the situation. So there's a whole crop tolerance thing, to sort of think about as well. Most of our herbicides are not a factor, but there's a few where maybe we'll see a little bit of shortening of the crop or a little bit of yellowing of the crop, and if that's the case, then you should think about those conditions.
Most of my neighbors and friends say it's a good thing I spray on dew because you got to mix the chemical with water sometimes.
In terms of the weather before spraying and after spraying, we actually have done research on that. So as long as you sort of have the day afterwards, as long as you have a reasonably sunny day and you're more than 10 degrees Celsius or whatever, that's going to be okay. But the 2 to 3 to 4 days before you spray can have a significant effect on terms of herbicide performance. So if it's been extremely hot and dry, that means that you have a thicker cuticle and more wax on the leaves, or if you're under drought stress or whatever. So it's about, in terms of weather conditions, sort of like 90% of the effect will be those 3 to 4 days before spraying, and only 10% will be the day after spraying. So. Now, people talked about when's it too cold or whatever. Some people said, well, if it freezes, well, obviously it freezes. If your sprayer's going to freeze up, then don't do that. So, but if you're just if you're talking like 5 degrees overnight or something like that, that's not a problem because we, as long as we know we're going to have a reasonably sunny, warm day the next day. And I think really anything that's 10 or 12 degrees Celsius is plants will start growing in those.
What are your comments on do with the glyphosate?
Glyphosate, yeah, I say it would be no different than any of the other ones we've talked about. I mean, what we know with glyphosate is it's one of the few ones that we know that the more concentrated the droplet is, the better penetration into the leaf. So that's why lower water volumes are actually more effective with glyphosate than high water volumes. We don't need coverage with glyphosate because it's systemic, it's highly translocated. So as long as we get, we don't need 50 droplets on a leaf, as long as we get 10, that's good enough. And if it's per droplet more concentrated, it actually works better. To a certain point, but really 5 would always be better than 10, and 3 might be better than 5 even with the glyphosate story. The whole glyphosate story is dust. I mean, that's the thing that you know already, so, because it's so tightly bound to any soil particles, in which dust is really a soil particle, that it just inactivates that glyphosate. So the only thing that's going to inhibit glyphosate activity is your dust in your air. I think there's a question over here.
Will the water volume affect how the droplets will coalesce? Like if you're in a heavy dew in the middle of the night, will you see a difference between a 4-gallon application and a 10-gallon application?
Well, I think it might depend a little bit more on droplet size. So I guess if they were very coarse droplets, they would just be larger when they go on themselves, and that means they wouldn't have to grow as much to get big enough to sort of go off the leaf. So if it was extremely coarse, I think that could potentially be a disadvantage. So, but I want to move into one more thing. The main disadvantage or a couple of disadvantages for doing that. We'll sort of get into that a bit. I mean, there's the obvious one. He has GPS capability and auto steer, but people sort of ask, well, what about other obstacles in the field? So, what about that slough hole that you don't know is there? Are you going to get stuck, or is there a tree falls down, or here we have lots of pivots and things like that. So, I mean, you have to sort of take all of that into consideration. The other main one that the spray experts will talk about is this inversion situation that can happen at night. And what that is we have a situation where we have a warm, sunny day, and the soil becomes very warm, and at night, the soil is warmer than the air. So the air is cooling off faster than the soil. The soil is radiating heat. And so air moves from warm to cold. So in that case, the air is sort of from the ground is actually sort of moving upwards, or at least it's resisting sort of movement down. And what can happen is you can spray in that situation, and the spray droplet, you think gravity is going to take it down to the ground, but this inversion factor can be enough to counteract gravity, and those spray droplets can sort of be suspended in the air, and they can sort of sit like a fog, like a little cloud sort of sitting there, and then they don't get down to where they're going, and you can end up in a situation where then they can actually move downwind. And this is, you've maybe heard examples of where you have a drift situation that's a mile from where you sprayed or 2 miles from where you sprayed. So it can actually drift that far and then will settle in the morning. So those conditions are when you have a pretty hot day and it cools off quite a bit at night, and you have no wind. So I mean, it's dead calm, so there's no mixing of the air to sort of counteract that. And I think if you think about dust at maybe off a gravel road, or dust at combining time in the fall, you maybe seen that dust hanging in the air. It just sits there. That's what we're talking about. And so that can happen with a spray cloud as well, or with our spray pattern. So in those situations, you need to be aware of that, and I guess in terms of maybe time of year. I don't think that would be much of a problem in April or May when we're doing our burn down treatments, or some of our herbicide treatments in early June. I don't know, or years, at least recently, it's been pretty cold weather. We don't have those conditions. And if we were spraying in the fall, I don't think we have those conditions as well. But I think, you know, maybe in the middle of June or a day like today could be a very real situation. Or if we're spraying in the middle of the season, some of our fungicides or insecticides, maybe you're not worried about drift killing your neighboring crop, but you might not be getting the coverage and thus losing sort of efficacy. So that's the number one disadvantage I see in terms of potentially spraying a night spraying. And certainly people like Tom Wolf in Saskatoon, or even you're going to talk to Brian Starovinsky later on this afternoon, that's what people will sort of talk about. So that's very real. Not, you know, I don't want anybody to discount that or whatever. So when you have that situation, it's a big potential problem. But I suspect there's probably, you know, 75% of the cases that's not really going to be a problem here in southern Alberta, especially in our windy environment. So.
That inversion no wind thing at harvest time seems to happen a couple or 3 times a year up in our country, and a friend of mine refers to that as harvesting by the Braille system when that happens, because you can't see anything sometimes.
So Bob, would it be fair to say too that maybe the risk of inversion or effects of inversion would be minimized now with the coarser sprays that we're using?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have any research to really document that out, but it came out of our conversations the last couple of days. And so, you know, just with the type of sprayers we have now, and we're trying to spray coarser sprays, you know, we are getting more penetration onto the plant. So we actually are, you know, we have larger droplets. So obviously those very small droplets, that are most prone to drift in a wind situation, are also the droplets that are most prone to sitting in this cloud and moving off-site. So if we go with our coarse, somewhat, medium to medium coarse droplets that we're probably going with anyway to avoid drift, it's probably lessen this effect of this inversion thing. And then the chemistry comes into play as well. The other question came up today. I mean, is there a difference between 2,4-D amine and 2,4-D ester? Well, we all know those ester formulations are more volatile and sit in the air, and if we get a drift situation, then they can be greater with that. In a normal drift situation, this inversion factor would be the same thing. So there could be some differences between products as well. So, yes.
Talking about evaporation on the leaf, will it rehydrate that chemical? And
yeah, that's
you still get that?
Yeah. So that's a good point. So as I talked about this droplet drying time, as soon as it dries down, the herbicide goes into a crystalline form. It's no longer in solution, so it goes into a crystal. That crystal cannot penetrate into the plant, so it sits there. Then if we have a little bit of light rainfall the next day or a little bit of dew, it can redissolve if we have enough, and so it can redissolve temporarily, and it can get entry again. So you would have to have that happen, probably within 12 hours, or certainly no more than 24 hours, because after that time, it would have dried up, it would have been degraded by UV radiation, it would have been blown off by winds, something else would have happened to it. But certainly within a short period of time, that's true. It could dry down, it can wet up again. And so that's the other reason, if you were to spray late in the evening, then you maybe have the slower droplet drying time. But if it did dry during the night and then you got to do it 5 or 6 in the morning, that could work. If you did spray during the day, it could dry down at 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you get a dew at midnight. It could actually do that. So that's the time frame we're talking about. A matter of hours, not days.
Is there any chemical group that might be more prone to bacterial versus some other ones, versus
Can you repeat the question? We can't hear it over here.
Yeah. So the question was about, sort of different modes of action or different groups of chemistry. Would some be more prone to being a problem or whatever? So I think, as I said before, the crops tolerate the chemistry in most cases because they degrade the herbicide and the weeds do not. So you need some favorable conditions for that to happen. I guess what I'm suggesting is if you spray in the night, in most of the time, the plant is still growing in the night. The physiological mechanisms that is happening of growing are still happening all night long. What you don't have is you don't have photosynthesis. So you don't have translocation, you don't have movement, but in terms of degrading that, the plant is still physiologically working away. In fact, it grows more at night than it does during the day. In fact, people do as well. You know, 2/3 of all of our nutrition ability, our growth of our cells in our bodies is happening when we sleep at night, not when we're awake during the daytime. So to a large extent, that's not the case. I think the bigger problem would be if we sprayed it on a really cold night and then it stayed really cold the next day. In that case, maybe the plant just isn't growing as much as it should be, and it might not break down the herbicide as much. So one case where we actually think it could actually work a little bit better in terms of this translocation story are contact herbicides such as Liberty or our Regulone treatment or our Gramoxone treatment. They have to get into the cell, but they kill it so quickly that there's no movement from one cell to another cell. And that's actually what inhibits the translocation. It's one of the reasons why we don't have any movement. If we do it at night, then this killing action is slowed down. So we can actually get a little bit of translocation with our so-called contact herbicides that will not move at all during the day. They will actually move a little bit during the night. And so we've seen sometimes a little bit better control with a Regulone or with a Liberty treatment. If we get a little bit movement in the night and then it sort of becomes growing more and the sunlight kicks in. Certainly like a Gramoxone treatment and dicot, they actually require sunlight to activate them. Not so much Liberty, but those ones actually require sunlight to do the job. So they can actually sort of work a little bit better in that situation possibly. So what we're going to look at some plots here, and I guess we're not really advocating night spraying. I think we wanted to have this conversation. I was just curious to know how many people are doing it. And I think obviously because of GPS now, we have a capability we didn't have 10 years ago. And I just wanted people to sort of think about the possibility. So if you've never thought about it, I just wanted people to sort of think about it. Because I think, when we have so many windy days or so many wet days that we've had the last couple of springs here, it's almost impossible to get the herbicide down when we want it to. So this is another opportunity to sort of spray at night maybe when you wouldn't have considered it in the past. We're going to look at some plots here. What we've found across the board on most of them is that it's equal between day and night. And that's not a bad news story. That's actually a very good news story. That means we can spray at night and we don't expect it to be any worse. We have a couple of cases where we actually think it's better when we sprayed at night than during the day. So we'll actually have a look at those, come into the plots and have a look, and then obviously you can ask more questions as we go along as well. I'll explain the plot layout is on page 17 in your booklet. And what we did here is we have a strip of barley running on the left-hand side if you're behind me, and we have a strip of field peas, and then we have a strip of camelina on the far right-hand side. And then on the far left over here, on every one, this is sprayed during the day, this little plot between the two orange colored stakes. And then if I just move over here, this is sprayed at night. And then we just have a check plot that's not sprayed at all. And that repeats itself across. And then we have 4 different strips. Our first, everything in here is Roundup. The next strip, everything is Liberty. The next one is Gramoxone, the third one, and the fourth one back there is Solo. And so what I tried to do in here is I have 2